Pocantico Hills, New York, 30 miles north of Manhattan. Spring 1913. The Hudson River curves below, silver in morning light. Hills rise green and ordered. Stone walls divide the landscape into deliberate sections, and at the highest point, commanding everything beneath it, stands a house that was never meant to be just a house. 4 stories, 40 rooms, classical revival architecture that borrows from Italian villas in Georgian estates, terraced gardens that step down the hillside in perfect geometric arrangement, art collections worth millions, a family name that by 1913 carries more weight than most governments. Kykuit, Dutch for lookout, the Rockefeller estate. John D. Rockefeller Jr. oversaw its construction. His father, John D. Rockefeller Sr., the man who built Standard Oil and became America's first billionaire, would live here. The house cost roughly $2 million to build between 1906 and 1913, over $60 million in today's currency. The land acquisition, the gardens, the art, those costs came separately and grew with each passing year. But here's the question that shadows every room, every terrace, every carefully curated vista. How do you build a monument to a fortune that millions of Americans believe was stolen? What do you create when your name means both extraordinary wealth and ruthless monopoly? When half the country sees you as a titan of industry and the other half sees you as a robber baron? This is not just the story of a house. It's the story of what happens when you try to use architecture, art, and philanthropy to transform a legacy. Of the invisible army that maintained the illusion of effortless grandeur, of a family navigating between immense privilege and genuine threat, of decisions made behind closed doors that still echo through American wealth and power today. If you enjoy deep investigations into America's great estates and the families who built them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. The story begins not with beauty, but with blood, with burning refineries and murdered workers, with a monopoly so complete that Congress had to invent new laws to break it. The Rockefellers didn't build Kykuit to celebrate their fortune. They built it to survive what that fortune had cost them. Let's begin. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was born in 1839 to a con artist father and a devoutly Baptist mother in upstate New York. By age 16, he was keeping books for a Cleveland merchant. By 23, he'd entered the oil refining business. By 31, he'd founded Standard Oil. What followed was the most aggressive consolidation of industrial power America had ever seen. Standard Oil didn't just compete, it dominated. Rockefeller negotiated secret rebates with railroads that gave him cheaper shipping than his competitors. He undercut rivals' prices until they collapsed, then bought their refineries for pennies. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of America's refining capacity. By 1990, it was closer to 95%. The wealth was extraordinary. In 1913, Rockefeller's fortune was estimated at roughly $900 million, nearly $27 billion in today's currency, but that comparison fails to capture the scale. In 1913, that was nearly 3% of America's entire gross domestic product. No one had ever accumulated that much concentrated wealth in human history. But wealth of that magnitude doesn't arrive without consequences. The public saw Standard Oil as a monopoly that crushed competition, fixed prices, and corrupted democracy. Journalists called Rockefeller a robber baron. Ida Tarbell's devastating exposé, The History of the Standard Oil Company, published between 1902 and 1904, documented the company's ruthless practices in exhaustive detail. Political cartoons depicted him as an octopus, tentacles wrapped around the nation's throat. By the time Kykuit's construction began in 1906, the Rockefeller name carried a weight that made daily life complicated. Threats arrived regularly. Kidnapping plots against the children and grandchildren felt plausible enough to require constant vigilance. The family moved through the world surrounded by security. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was 67 years old when Kykuit's construction began. His health was failing. Stress and overwork had cost him his hair, his digestive system, and his ability to sleep through the night without waking in pain. He'd already stepped back from Standard Oil's day-to-day operations. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., 28 in 1906, carried a different burden. Jr., as the family called him, had grown up inside the fortress his father's fortune created. He'd attended Brown University. He'd married Abby Aldrich, daughter of Senator Nelson Aldrich, in 1901. By 1906, he had 3 young sons and the weight of managing a fortune he hadn't built but couldn't escape. Jr. was not his father. Where Sr. was ruthless in business, Jr. was thoughtful, cautious, religious. Where Sr. built an empire, Jr. would spend decades trying to rehabilitate the name attached to it. Kykuit was part of that rehabilitation, not just a house, a statement, a carefully constructed argument in stone and landscape that the Rockefellers were more than their critics claimed. The construction would take 7 years. The transformation of the family's reputation would take much longer. The land came first. John D. Rockefeller Sr. began purchasing property in Pocotantico Hills in the 1890s. The location wasn't random. 30 miles north of Manhattan meant proximity to the city without being trapped inside it. The Hudson River provided natural beauty and a psychological barrier. The hills offered elevation, commanding views, and the kind of visual dominance that suited a man accustomed to controlling whatever he surveyed. By the time construction began, the Rockefeller holdings in Pocotantico Hills encompassed roughly 3,400 acres. Not the largest estate in America, but substantial. Enough land to create privacy, security, and the illusion of a self-contained world. But land alone wasn't enough. The house had to embody something more than mere wealth. It had to suggest permanence, taste, legitimacy, the kind of establishment respectability that might, over time, soften the edges of how America saw the Rockefeller fortune. The architects were Chester Holmes Aldrich and William Adams Delano. Aldrich was Abby Rockefeller's cousin. The choice wasn't coincidence. Family connections mattered when building something this visible and this symbolic. Delano and Aldrich designed in the Beaux-Arts style filtered through colonial revival sensibilities. Classical proportions, symmetry, restraint. The exterior featured stone from local quarries, Hudson Valley granite, solid and substantial. The roof was slate. The overall effect suggested Georgian elegance crossed with Italian villa spaciousness. This was not Newport's marble excess, not Biltmore's French chateau ambition. Kykuit was designed to feel established, not ostentatious, old money, not new. The irony being that Rockefeller wealth was about as new as American fortunes came, built in less than 40 years from near nothing to incomprehensible scale. The house itself would contain 40 rooms initially, though the count would grow with renovations. 4 floors, central hall plan with rooms radiating from a core staircase. Service areas carefully hidden from primary living spaces. Technology throughout, electricity, central heating, modern plumbing, but deployed invisibly. The original design was completed by 1908, but Sr. hated it. The house felt too grand, too showy. It drew exactly the kind of attention the family was trying to manage carefully. So they tore down portions and rebuilt, scaled back the size, modified the facade. The reconstruction added years to the timeline and hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost. By 1913, the house reached its final form. 4 stories, roughly 40 rooms in the main house, though the exact count shifted as rooms were combined or divided. Stone facade, classical proportions. Terraced gardens designed by William Wells Bosworth stretched down the hillside, formal gardens, sculpture gardens, fountains, and carefully planned vistas. From the highest terrace you could see for miles the Hudson River, the Palisades beyond, villages dotting the valley below. It was the view of someone who'd conquered, not someone who'd inherited. The view of someone who'd built an empire and was now building something to outlast it. But views are performances,
and every performance requires people behind the curtain.
Standard Oil was formally dissolved in 1911. The Supreme Court ruled that the company violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The monopoly was broken into 34 separate companies. On paper, this was meant to restore competition. In reality, Rockefeller owned significant shares in most of the successor companies. When Standard Oil of New Jersey's stock price soared after the breakup, Rockefeller's fortune increased rather than diminished. But the public relations damage was done. The Supreme Court had confirmed what millions already believed. The Rockefeller fortune was built on illegal monopoly practices. The name itself carried that stain. Junior understood this more clearly than his father. Senior had built the empire with focused brutality. He'd seen competition as war and operated accordingly. Junior inherited the consequences without the instincts that had generated them. Kykuit represented one response: demonstrate through architecture, landscape, and lifestyle that the Rockefellers were more than monopolists. Show taste, show restraint, show connection to American history and values through colonial revival design. Show appreciation for art and beauty through careful curation. The other response was philanthropy on an unprecedented scale. The Rockefeller Foundation was established in 1913, the same year Kykuit was completed. Its initial endowment was $100 million, over $3 billion today. The foundation would fund medical research, public health initiatives, education, and scientific advancement. It would help eradicate hookworm in the American South. It would fund universities and hospitals. It would, over decades, do genuine good, while also serving as the largest reputation rehabilitation effort in American history. Junior drove much of this. He believed in it sincerely. He was genuinely religious, genuinely convinced that wealth carried obligations, genuinely troubled by the methods his father had used to accumulate it. But sincerity doesn't erase origin. The Rockefeller Foundation was funded by Standard Oil profits. Kykuit was maintained by Standard Oil profits. Every garden, every sculpture, every carefully preserved vista existed because of refined petroleum sold under monopoly conditions. The house embodied that contradiction: beautiful and built on extraction, tasteful and purchased with ruthlessness, a monument to what wealth could create and a reminder of what it had cost. And maintaining the monument required an army that most visitors never saw. Construction employed hundreds: stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from local villages, landscapers who spent years moving earth and planting the thousands of trees, shrubs, and flowering plants that Bosworth's design required. The stone came from nearby quarries, hauled by wagon and later truck. Marble for interior work arrived by rail from Vermont. The roof slates came from Pennsylvania. Every material was inspected, every measurement checked. Junior supervised personally, making changes, demanding corrections, extending the timeline whenever something failed to meet standards. The workforce peaked at roughly 300 men during the main construction phase. They worked 6-day weeks. Pay was decent for the era. Skilled stonemasons earned roughly $4 to $5 per day. Laborers earned $2 to $3. Better than sweatshop wages in Manhattan, less than what unionized workers in the building trades were starting to demand in cities. Some workers lived in boarding houses in nearby villages. Others camped on the property during intensive construction periods. The Rockefellers provided some housing for key staff, but most workers were temporary, hired for specific phases and released when that work finished. Who were they? Mostly immigrants or sons of immigrants: Italian, Irish, German, Polish. Men who'd come to America looking for work and found it in the endless construction projects that industrialist wealth generated. Their names appear in some payroll records, but rarely in family correspondence or newspaper accounts. A few died during construction. Accidents were common in building projects of this scale: a fall from scaffolding, a stone block that shifted. The records don't provide details on every incident. What's documented is that Junior generally paid death benefits to families, more than legally required, but not enough to transform the calculation that had made the work worthwhile in the first place. By 1913, the main house stood complete.
The gardens would continue to evolve for years. Bosworth kept refining, planting, adjusting the terraces and pathways through the 1920s. But the core structure was finished. Sr. moved in. Junior, Abby, and their growing family, 6 children eventually, occupied spaces throughout the estate. A second house, the Eyrie, sat on a different part of the property and would later be expanded for Junior's family. And with the family in residence, a different workforce took over. Not builders, but maintainers. Not temporary, but permanent. The invisible labor that would keep Kykuit functioning for the next century.
4:30 in the morning, 5 at the latest. The kitchen staff woke first. Kykuit's kitchens, located in the basement level, were vast by residential standards, but cramped for the demands placed on them. Coal ranges had to be lit early enough that by the time the family took breakfast at 8, food could be prepared at proper temperature without the staff appearing rushed. Scullery maids hauled water despite Kykuit's modern plumbing. The kitchens required constant manual labor, scrubbing pots after the previous night's dinner, washing china, polishing silver, work that modern technology had made slightly easier but nowhere near eliminated. Housemaids followed shortly after 5. Their first task was fireplaces. Even with central heating, the primary rooms maintained decorative fires. Each grate needed cleaning from yesterday's ash, fresh kindling laid, logs positioned. The fires would be lit before the family descended for breakfast. Dusting came next. Furniture, mantels, picture frames, sculpture bases. Everything was dusted daily, whether visibly dirty or not. Mrs. Rockefeller Sr., Laura, known as SETI, inspected rooms regularly. Dust meant failure. Failure meant dismissal. The house had to be fully awake and functioning before anyone upstairs opened their eyes. By 6:30, the day staff arrived. Gardeners, groundskeepers, chauffeurs, stablemen. Kykuit maintained extensive transportation infrastructure, cars, carriages, horses, and later motorized vehicles in increasing numbers. The grounds required constant attention. 3,400 acres meant roads to maintain, walls to repair, fences to check, gates to monitor. By 7, the family's personal servants were at work, valets for senior and junior, ladies' maids for the women. These were the elite of the below-stairs hierarchy, the people who dressed the family, maintained their wardrobes, attended to personal needs, and moved through the private spaces that housemaids entered only to clean when the rooms were empty. The house contained 2 separate worlds. Upstairs, light, space, art, leisure. Below, narrow service corridors painted institutional green, lit by bare bulbs, crowded with staff moving rapidly to maintain the upstairs illusion. The architecture enforced this separation. Service stairs ran from basement to attic, hidden behind doors disguised as panels. Servants used these exclusively. Family and guests never saw them. Meals traveled from basement kitchens to dining rooms via dumbwaiters or carried by footmen up the service stairs, entering the dining room through doors that remained invisible until they opened. The bell system controlled movement. Every major room upstairs had a bell pull. When someone tugged the embroidered cord, a corresponding bell jangled downstairs in the servants' corridor. Each bell had a distinct tone. Experienced staff could identify the calling room by sound alone. When a bell rang, someone moved immediately. The family and their guests did not wait. Being summoned meant dropping whatever task you were performing and reporting to the designated location. Delays resulted in reprimands. Repeated delays resulted in dismissal.
The hierarchy below stairs was rigid. At the top, the butler, who managed male staff and oversaw formal service, and the housekeeper, who managed female staff and controlled household supplies. Both reported directly to family members, but operated with significant autonomy within their domains. Just beneath them came valets and ladies' maids, personal servants attached to individual family members. These positions required discretion, loyalty, and the ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Below that tier, footmen, who served meals and attended to public areas. Housemaids, who cleaned the dozens of rooms daily. Laundresses, who handled the enormous volume of linens, clothing, and table coverings. Kitchen staff, from cooks down to scullery maids. Outside staff formed a parallel hierarchy: head gardener, under gardeners, groundskeepers, chauffeurs, stablemen, estate workers who maintained the 3,400 acres. At the very bottom, hall boys and scullery maids, teenagers, often 14 or 15 years old, doing the filthiest work for the smallest pay, scrubbing pots, hauling coal, emptying chamber pots even though Kykuit had modern plumbing. Old habits and preferences died slowly. Everyone knew their place. Crossing boundaries meant consequences. Upper servants ate separately from lower servants. Even at meals, hierarchy was enforced. What the staff actually earned is documented in household ledgers. The butler drew roughly $1,000 to $1,200 per year, plus room and board, a substantial salary for the era. Housemaids earned $300 to $400. Laundresses earned $250 to $350. Scullery maids earned $150 to $200. Hall boys earned even less. For context, Junior spent roughly $100,000 per year on art acquisitions in the 1920s. A single painting sometimes cost more than the annual wages of 10 housemaids combined. The Rockefellers paid competitively by the standards of great estates, better than many peers. Staff received medical care when sick, death benefits to families if workers died in service, Christmas bonuses, time off, though limited. By contemporary standards, these were reasonable conditions, but context changes everything. The Rockefellers were building one of the world's great art collections while paying the people who maintained the house containing that art a few $100s per year. What the servants actually thought is only partly visible. A handful of letters survive, occasional diary entries, oral histories collected decades later from children of staff members. The picture that emerges is complicated. Many stayed for years, even decades, suggesting acceptable conditions. Staff took pride in working at Kykuit. The Rockefeller name carried prestige even among those who served it. The work was exhausting but stable. The pay was regular. In an era when unemployment could mean starvation, steady work at decent wages mattered. Yet the awareness of difference never disappeared. One housekeeper recalled years later that Mrs. Rockefeller Jr., Abby, was unfailingly kind, but also utterly unaware of what staff daily life actually required. Kindness from a position of total control is still a form of control. A chauffeur who worked at Kykuit in the 1920s remembered driving Junior to the city for foundation meetings while earning $800 per year. The chauffeur noted the contrast without apparent bitterness. That was simply how the world worked. The distance between those who controlled wealth and those who enabled its daily functioning was understood, accepted, permanent. The Rockefellers were not notorious tyrants. By most accounts, they treated staff better than many of their peers in the world of great estates. But a gentle master is still a master. Fair wages in an unfair system are still wages paid from profits generated by that system. The beauty of Kykuit depended on this arrangement. The gardens stayed perfect because gardeners worked dawn to dusk. The house stayed pristine because housemaids cleaned ceaselessly. The family moved through their days without encountering the machinery of their lives because that machinery was designed to be invisible. Stand in the formal gardens today. Look at the terraced walkways, the sculpture gardens, the carefully maintained vistas. Then look backward through time at the people who made those vistas possible, who weeded, planted, pruned, watered, who hauled stone, who maintained the illusion that beauty simply existed rather than requiring constant labor to sustain. Their names, with only a few exceptions, have disappeared from the record, but their work remains, encoded in every perfectly straight hedge and weedless flowerbed.
The family settled into Kykuit in 1913. Sr., now 74, spent increasing time there. His health remained fragile. Digestive problems plagued him. He slept poorly. But Pocantico offered something Manhattan never could: privacy, security, space to move without constant awareness of public opinion. He played golf on the estate's 9-hole course, took drives through the property's carefully maintained roads, received carefully screened visitors. His daily routine was managed down to 15-minute increments by junior staff.
Sr. was no longer running Standard Oil. The breakup had removed him from active management, even if his fortune continued growing through stock holdings. His focus shifted to philanthropy, guided by advisors and increasingly by Jr. The routine was comfortable, even peaceful, but it rested on a foundation that was anything but peaceful. The years immediately following Kykuit's completion were turbulent. World War I broke out in Europe in 1914. The Rockefeller Foundation funded war relief efforts. Jr. navigated the complicated politics of American neutrality while managing investments that profited from supplying the Allied war effort. In 1914, another event reshaped the family's public image in ways architecture couldn't fix: the Ludlow Massacre. Colorado, April 20, 1914. Coal miners striking against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a company in which Rockefeller held significant shares. The miners, mostly immigrants, lived in company-owned housing and were paid in company scrip usable only at company stores. They struck demanding better pay, safer conditions, union recognition. The company evicted strikers from company housing. Families set up tent colonies. The Colorado National Guard, funded partly by the company, surrounded the camps. On April 20th, shooting broke out. The Guard set fire to the tents. When the smoke cleared, 21 people were dead, including 2 women and 11 children who'd suffocated in a pit beneath a burning tent. The massacre became national news, and the Rockefeller name was attached because of the family's investment in Colorado Fuel and Iron. Jr. had never set foot in Colorado. He hadn't ordered the attack. He likely hadn't even known the specific details of the strike's progression. But ownership meant responsibility. The Rockefeller fortune profited from Colorado coal, and Colorado coal was extracted under conditions that led directly to Ludlow. The public relations disaster was immense. Protests erupted. Anarchists placed a bomb outside Jr.'s Manhattan townhouse. Ida Tarbell, already the family's most devastating critic, wrote follow-up pieces. Cartoonists depicted Jr. and Sr. with blood on their hands. Jr. responded in ways that would define his approach for decades. He hired Ivy Lee, a public relations pioneer who would help craft the modern notion of corporate image management. He visited Colorado personally, went down into the mines, met with workers, instituted reforms. He commissioned investigations. He shifted company policies. Whether these actions stemmed from genuine moral crisis or calculated reputation management remains debated, likely both. Jr. was sincerely troubled by Ludlow. He was also keenly aware that the Rockefeller name had become synonymous with robber baron excess, and Ludlow confirmed every criticism. Kykuit, completed just a year before Ludlow, represented one approach to legacy: build something beautiful, demonstrate taste and restraint, show that wealth could be used responsibly. Ludlow revealed the limits of that approach. You couldn't architecture your way out of moral complicity in industrial violence. But you could try to balance the scales. Over the following decades, the Rockefeller fortune would fund projects that genuinely improved millions of lives. The foundation's public health work eliminated diseases. Its education funding built institutions. Its medical research advanced science. None of this erased Ludlow. None of it changed how Standard Oil had been built. But it complicated the narrative in ways that pure opposition couldn't easily accommodate. The Rockefellers were robber barons. The Rockefellers funded life-saving research. Both statements were true. And Kykuit stood at the center of this contradiction. A beautiful house on a beautiful estate, maintained by people earning a few $100s per year, funded by a fortune built on monopoly practices, owned by a family trying to transform what that fortune meant for American history.
Daily life at Kykuit followed patterns that would persist for decades. Mornings began with breakfast at 8. The family gathered in the breakfast room, smaller than the formal dining room, more intimate. Staff served from silver platters. Fresh flowers on the table, changed daily by the gardening staff. Orange juice from the estate's greenhouse orangery. Coffee, eggs, bacon, toast, fruit. Breakfast conversations centered on business, philanthropy, and family matters. Sr., when present, discussed foundation projects. Jr. reviewed his schedule, board meetings, site visits, correspondence. The children, when old enough, received instructions on education and deportment.
After breakfast, the men went to business. Junior maintained offices both in Manhattan and on the estate. Senior, increasingly, remained at Pocantico, meeting with advisors who came to him. The women managed the household. Abby Rockefeller Jr., by the 1920s, was emerging as a significant art collector in her own right. She championed modern art, a stark contrast to the traditional European masters her father-in-law preferred. Her patronage would help establish the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. She spent mornings reviewing household accounts with the housekeeper, planning menus with the cook, discussing estate maintenance with the head gardener, and working on her art acquisitions and philanthropic projects. The children, 6 eventually, Abby, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, followed rigid schedules. Tutors, then boarding schools, lessons in deportment, languages, music, training in the responsibility their name carried. Lunch was informal, unless guests were present. 1 o'clock. Family members often ate separately depending on schedules. Staff prepared multiple meals to accommodate different timings. Afternoons meant business for the men, household management for the women, lessons for the children. Senior took drives through the estate, played golf when health permitted, received visitors. The estate itself required constant supervision. The 3,400 acres encompassed not just the main house and gardens, but also working farmland, forest, roads, utilities, and employee housing. The head gardener supervised a staff of 20 to 30. The farm produced food for the household and employed additional workers. Maintenance crews kept roads passable, walls standing, gates functioning. This was not simply a residence, it was an economic system. A miniature fiefdom employing hundreds, generating its own food, maintaining its own infrastructure, operating with near-complete self-sufficiency. Tea was served at 4, formal, in the drawing room when weather was poor, on the terraces when pleasant. Fine china, silver service, sandwiches, pastries, and cakes prepared by kitchen staff who'd been working since before dawn. Dinner was the day's formal event. 7 o'clock, evening dress required. Family and any guests assembled in the drawing room for cocktails first, though Senior abstained, maintaining his Baptist teetotaling principles, even as the younger generation quietly bent those rules. At 7:30, the butler announced dinner. The party moved to the dining room. Place settings were orchestrated precisely: gold-rimmed china, crystal glassware, silver flatware, fresh flowers, candelabras. Meals consisted of multiple courses: soup, fish, main course, often multiple options, salad, dessert, cheese, fruit. Each course served by footmen in livery, trained to serve from the left, remove from the right, move silently, anticipate needs. Conversation at dinner covered art, politics, business, society. The Rockefellers entertained carefully. Guests were selected for compatibility with family interests and values. Celebrities, politicians, artists, intellectuals, but only those whose presence reinforced rather than threatened the family's carefully constructed image. After dinner, the men sometimes retired to the library for brandy and cigars. The women moved to the drawing room. Later, the party might reconvene for music. The estate had multiple pianos and later phonographs. By 10 or 10:30, the family retired. Valets and ladies' maids attended to evening routines, baths drawn, clothes laid out for morning, night clothes prepared. Downstairs, the staff worked for hours more. Dishes from dinner had to be washed, silver polished, kitchen cleaned, preparations made for tomorrow's breakfast. The housemaids did a final check of fireplaces. The night watchman began his rounds. The last lights in the service areas didn't go out until midnight or later, and at 4:30 the next morning, it began again. This was the routine during family residence, but Kykuit also served as a gathering place for extended family, a venue for foundation meetings, and a showcase for important visitors. When guests arrived, and they arrived frequently through the 1920s and 1930s, the choreography intensified. Extra staff hired, bedrooms prepared, menus planned weeks in advance, entertainment arranged, every detail orchestrated to create the impression of effortless hospitality. The performance was nearly perfect. Guests remembered Kykuit as a place of remarkable beauty and comfort. The service was impeccable. The art collections were stunning. The gardens were paradise. What guests didn't see was the mechanism that made it function. the basement kitchens where staff worked 12-hour shifts during major events, the service corridors where maids and footmen rushed to stay ahead of demands, the estate workshops where maintenance crews repaired everything from plumbing to picture frames. The division was physical and absolute. Above, beauty and leisure. Below, labor and speed. And the architecture made certain those worlds never visibly intersected. Stand in the grand entrance hall today. Look at the marble floors, the sweeping staircase, the carefully placed sculptures. Then imagine the same moment from below. The housemaid who scrubbed those marble floors before dawn, the footman who polished the brass stair rods, the housekeeper who checked every detail before the family descended. The house was magnificent. The house was also a machine that consumed human labor to produce the appearance of effortless grace.
The 1920s marked Kykuit's peak as a social and cultural center. Sr. died in 1937 at age 97, but through the 20s and early 30s he remained a presence on the estate. Jr. had fully assumed control of the family's philanthropy and business interests by then, but he deferred to his father on estate matters. The guest list through those years read like a roster of American power: politicians, industrialists, artists, intellectuals. Nelson Rockefeller, Jr.'s third son, brought his interest in Latin American affairs and modern art. Lawrence brought his focus on conservation. David, the youngest, would later become chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and bring financial leaders to family gatherings. Abby Rockefeller Jr.'s influence grew. Her modern art collection expanded. She convinced Jr. to support the founding of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. The contrast was striking. Sr. collected Renaissance masters. Abby championed Picasso, Matisse, and American modernists. Kykuit became a place where these different visions coexisted. Traditional European art in Sr.'s spaces, modern works in Abby's areas. The estate's aesthetic reflected the generational shift happening within the family. The gardens reached their mature form during this period. Bosworth had died in 1966, but his design continued to evolve under subsequent landscape architects and the estate's head gardeners. The terraces became home to an expanding sculpture collection: classical statues, modern works, Asian pieces acquired during family travels. Every season brought new plantings, new arrangements, new efforts to perfect what was already nearly perfect. The gardening staff worked year-round. Winter meant pruning, planning, maintenance. Spring and summer meant constant planting, watering, weeding. Fall meant preparation for winter's cold. The costs were substantial and growing. Monthly operating expenses for the estate in the 1920s ran to roughly $50,000, over $800,000 in today's currency. Annually, that meant $600,000 or more just to maintain the property. Staff wages, supplies, food, utilities, maintenance, improvements. For most American families, this would have been impossible. For the Rockefellers, it was manageable, but not trivial. The fortune was immense, but it was also supporting extensive philanthropic commitments, multiple properties, and the needs of a growing family, with each generation expecting their own resources. The arithmetic worked, but it required constant attention. Jr. personally reviewed household accounts. He questioned expenses. He insisted on competitive bidding for major projects. The stereotype of unlimited wealth spending without thought was never accurate for the Rockefellers. They spent carefully, even strategically. But careful spending at this scale still meant spending more per month than most Americans earned in years. The social importance of Kykuit during this period stemmed partly from the Rockefeller name and partly from the family's growing influence in philanthropy, politics, and culture. The foundation's work in public health and education had tangible results. Hookworm was largely eliminated in the American South through foundation-funded programs. Medical schools received transformative grants. Universities expanded with Rockefeller's support. This influence meant access. When the Rockefellers expressed interest in a cause or candidate, doors opened. When they hosted gatherings at Kykuit, attendance was nearly mandatory for anyone seeking funding or support. The power was real and carefully wielded. Jr. believed deeply in the responsibility wealth conveyed. He also understood that power maintained required visible restraint. Kykuit's aesthetic, classically beautiful but not ostentatiously overwhelming, reflected that understanding. Weekend house parties became regular events. Guests arrived Friday evening by car or train to nearby Tarrytown, then were driven to the estate. Bedrooms were prepared, activities planned, conversation directed toward foundation business or family interests. These were not frivolous gatherings. They were where decisions were made, alliances formed, futures shaped. A weekend at Kykuit meant exposure to the network of Rockefeller-supported institutions and individuals. Careers were advanced, projects were funded, all in settings of remarkable beauty and comfort. The performance worked. Guests left impressed by the family's taste, generosity, and commitment to improving society. The reputation that Standard Oil had damaged, the stain Ludlow had deepened, began slowly to shift. But beneath the gatherings and the carefully managed public image, pressure was building. The Great Depression was coming, and with it questions about concentrated wealth and its role in American democracy that would challenge everything the Rockefellers had built.
October 1929. The stock market crashed. The Rockefeller fortune, diversified and carefully managed, survived better than most. But the depression that followed reshaped American attitudes toward wealth in ways that no amount of philanthropy could fully offset. Unemployment reached 25%. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, breadlines stretched through cities. And while the Rockefellers weren't blamed for causing the depression, the existence of their fortune while millions starved became harder to justify with simple appeals to economic freedom. Junior responded with increased philanthropy. The foundation expanded relief programs. The family funded job creation projects. Junior personally oversaw the construction of Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, a massive development that provided thousands of construction jobs during the Depression's worst years. Rockefeller Center also served another purpose. It demonstrated that private wealth could drive public benefit through strategic investment. The project was ambitious, risky, and ultimately transformative for Manhattan's landscape. But good works couldn't erase the fundamental question the Depression raised. Should any family possess this much concentrated wealth while so many possessed nothing? The political response took forms that directly threatened the Rockefeller model. Federal income taxes had existed since 1913, but rates remained low through the 1920s. The Depression changed that calculus. By the mid-1930s, top marginal tax rates reached 70%, then climbed higher under Roosevelt's New Deal. Estate taxes rose similarly. Inheritance had always faced taxation, but the rates increased substantially during the Depression era. The principle behind these taxes was clear. Concentrated wealth should not pass generationally without significant contribution to public coffers. For the Rockefellers, this meant strategic planning became essential. Trusts were established. Assets were distributed to multiple family members to reduce estate tax burdens. Philanthropic giving accelerated partly from genuine commitment and partly from tax advantages that made giving away wealth more attractive than passing it through estate settlement. Kykuit's costs during this period remained stable, but represented an increasing burden relative to what taxation was extracting. The estate cost roughly $600,000 per year to maintain. That figure didn't include major improvements or additions to art collections, just basic operations. For context, Junior's annual income from investments and trust distributions likely exceeded $5 million during this period, even after taxes. So Kykuit consumed roughly 12% of annual income, manageable but not trivial, and unlike productive assets, the estate generated no financial return beyond personal use and social influence. The question Junior faced, though he didn't articulate it explicitly during the 1930s, was whether maintaining Kykuit made strategic sense given changing tax structures and social attitudes. He chose to maintain it, partly from attachment. It was his father's primary residence until 1937, partly from utility. It remained valuable for family gatherings and foundation business, partly from principle. Abandoning the estate would have suggested retreat in the face of criticism. Sr. died on May 23, 1937. He was 97. His death received national coverage. Some obituaries celebrated his industrial achievements and philanthropy. Others couldn't resist noting Standard Oil's monopoly practices and the violence at Ludlow. His estate was valued at roughly $26 million, a fraction of his peak wealth, the rest having been distributed during his lifetime through trusts and philanthropy. The strategic planning had worked. Estate taxes were minimized. The fortune would continue across generations. Junior inherited Kykuit and the responsibility of determining its future. He was 63. His children were adults. The question was whether the estate should continue serving as primary family residence or transform into something else. The decision was complicated by war. Europe had already erupted. America's entry seemed increasingly likely, and war would reshape everything again.
World War II arrived for America on December 7, 1941. The Rockefeller family's response to the war reflected both genuine patriotism and strategic calculation. Nelson Rockefeller, Jr.'s third son, took a position in the Roosevelt administration focused on Latin American relations. The foundation funded war relief. The family supported the war effort materially and publicly. Kykuit's operations changed significantly. Many male staff members enlisted or were drafted. The estate's younger workers left first: chauffeurs, gardeners, maintenance staff, the people whose labor kept the property functioning smoothly. Female staff filled some gaps, but not all. The gardens received less intensive maintenance. The grounds were kept neat, but not perfect. Non-essential maintenance was deferred. The house itself required just as much cleaning, so housemaids' workloads increased. Food rationing affected even the wealthy. The estate's kitchen gardens expanded to supplement what could be purchased. The Rockefellers, like all Americans, received ration books. Staff meals grew simpler. Guest entertainment became less elaborate. But Kykuit never approached hardship. The family had resources that rationing inconvenienced without truly limiting. The adjustments were real, but modest compared to what most Americans experienced. The war ended in 1945. Staff members returned, though not all. Some had died, others had found different work. The estate workforce rebuilt slowly through the late 1940s and into the 50s. Junior was now 71. His children were established in their own careers. John D. Rockefeller III focused on philanthropy. Nelson pursued politics and would later become governor of New York and vice president. Lawrence concentrated on conservation. Winthrop moved to Arkansas and would become governor there. David rose through Chase Manhattan Bank. The question of Kykuit's future grew more pressing. Junior still used it, but less frequently. His health was declining. The cost of maintaining the estate hadn't decreased. If anything, post-war inflation had increased operating expenses. Staff wages rose with the strengthening economy and more competitive job markets. Monthly operating costs by the late 1940s approached $75,000, over $1 million in today's currency. Annually, nearly $900,000 just to keep the property functional. The arithmetic was becoming uncomfortable, not impossible, but increasingly difficult to justify. The estate consumed resources that could fund additional philanthropy. It required staff time that could be directed toward more productive work. And it represented a kind of concentrated personal luxury that post-war America was viewing with increasing skepticism. Junior began considering options. The estate could continue as family property, passed to the next generation. It could be donated to an institution, a university perhaps, or a museum. It could be sold, though finding a buyer capable of maintaining it seemed unlikely. Or it could be demolished, the land returned to different use. Each option carried implications. Continuing meant ongoing costs and the appearance of dynastic excess. Donating meant loss of control and potential conflicts over how the property would be used. Selling seemed impractical. Demolishing would appear wasteful and would erase what had been carefully built. Junior didn't decide immediately. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Kykuit continued functioning, though with growing questions about its long-term role.
What had been built to establish permanence now faced the reality that permanence costs money and requires justification. And in post-war America, the justifications that worked in 1913 no longer carried the same weight. The house remained beautiful, the gardens remained spectacular, the art collections continued growing, particularly under Nelson's influence, as modern and contemporary works joined the traditional European pieces. But beauty alone couldn't answer the arithmetic question. Was maintaining this worthwhile given changing tax structures, changing social attitudes, and changing family needs? The decision would ultimately fall to the next generation. Junior would die in 1960. His sons would determine Kykuit's fate, and their choice would reflect not just practical considerations, but deeper questions about what the Rockefeller name should mean in the second half of the 20th century.
The 1950s brought stability, but not resolution. Junior continued residing at Kykuit through most of the decade, though his health limited his activities. He spent more time at other family properties, Florida in winter, Maine in summer, but Pocantico remained his primary residence. The estate continued functioning much as it had for decades. Staff maintained the house and grounds. The gardens stayed beautiful. The art collections grew. Family gatherings still occurred, though less frequently than during the 1920s and 30s. But the context had shifted. The Depression's end and the war's conclusion had reshaped American economic expectations. The middle class was expanding. Suburban development was accelerating. Home ownership was becoming accessible to millions who'd never imagined such stability. Against that backdrop, maintaining a 3,400-acre estate with a 40-room mansion and staff of dozens looked increasingly anachronistic. Not wrong necessarily, but out of step with where America was moving. Nelson Rockefeller had become governor of New York in 1959. His political career meant constant public scrutiny of family wealth. Questions about inherited privilege and dynastic power followed him throughout his political life. Kykuit became a symbol opponents used to suggest he couldn't understand ordinary Americans' struggles. These attacks were both fair and unfair. Fair because Nelson had grown up with extraordinary privilege, unfair because he'd worked seriously in public service and supported policies that genuinely helped working families. But perception mattered more than nuance, and Kykuit's existence made perception more complicated. Junior died on May 11, 1960, at age 86. His death marked the end of an era. He'd lived through Standard Oil's peak, its breakup, Ludlow, 2 world wars, the Depression, and the emergence of modern philanthropic institutions he'd helped build. His estate planning had been careful. Assets were distributed through trusts established years earlier. The fortune continued across generations with minimal estate tax burden. Kykuit passed to his sons jointly. The practical question was who would use it and how. Nelson had the strongest attachment and the resources to support it. He made Kykuit his primary residence after Junior's death. He expanded the modern art collections significantly. He commissioned contemporary sculptures for the gardens. He used the estate for political entertaining and foundation business. The other brothers used it for family gatherings but didn't reside there. David maintained a residence elsewhere in Westchester County. The others had their own properties scattered across the country.
Nelson's use pattern differed from Junior's. Where Junior had been somewhat reclusive, Nelson was aggressively social. Kykuit became a venue for political strategy sessions, fundraisers, and high-level diplomatic entertaining. Heads of state visited, artists came to discuss commissions, business leaders attended gatherings that shaped policy. This intensified use meant intensified costs, more staff, more events, more maintenance. Operating expenses by the mid-1960s were approaching $100,000 per month, over $1 million in today's currency, nearly $1.2 million per year. Nelson could afford it. His portion of the family fortune was substantial, and his governor's salary added to that, but the expense was becoming less sustainable as a purely private matter. The solution that emerged over the following decade involved a complex arrangement. The house and surrounding land would eventually transfer to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The family would retain certain use rights. The property would be preserved, but with public access and institutional support for operating costs. This resolution wouldn't be finalized until the 1990s, long after Nelson's death in 1979. But the framework began developing in the 1960s as it became clear that purely private maintenance was becoming impractical. The fundamental problem was structural. Estates of Kykuit's scale required either enormous wealth or institutional support. The Rockefellers had enormous wealth, but taxation and changing social expectations made purely private operation increasingly untenable. If the family maintained complete private control, they faced criticism for dynastic excess. If they transferred it to public or institutional ownership, they faced criticism for abandoning responsibility. The solution, hybrid ownership with family use rights and public access, split the difference. But reaching that solution took decades. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Kykuit continued as Nelson's primary residence. The staff maintained operations, the gardens stayed perfect, the house remained beautiful. And the question that had shadowed the estate since 1913 remained: what does it mean to maintain something this scale in a democracy? When does private magnificence become public concern? Where's the line between legitimate wealth and illegitimate excess? The Rockefellers never found clean answers. They adjusted, adapted, compromised, but they kept the estate functioning through financial crises, wars, social upheaval, and fundamental shifts in American attitudes toward wealth. That persistence itself reveals something important. Kykuit survived not because maintaining it was easy, but because the family decided survival mattered enough to justify the costs. Whether that choice was right remains contested.
The 1970s brought fundamental changes. Nelson Rockefeller became vice president in 1974 under Gerald Ford, following Richard Nixon's resignation. His time in that office was brief, less than 2 years, but it represented the apex of Rockefeller political influence. It also meant unprecedented scrutiny. Congressional hearings examined his finances in detail. Critics questioned whether someone of his wealth could serve public interest objectively. The gift reporting requirements exposed how much money moved through the family's networks. Kykuit became a focal point during these hearings. The estate's value was assessed. Its operating costs were documented. Nelson's use of it for political entertaining was examined. The hearings revealed what family members already knew. Maintaining Kykuit was expensive and becoming so. Operating costs in the mid-1970s exceeded $1.5 million per year when including not just daily operations, but also major maintenance, improvements, and staff benefits. For context, the median American household income in 1975 was roughly $13,000. Kykuit's annual operating budget was more than 100 median households earned combined. Nelson could afford it, but the optics were difficult, particularly for someone in public office claiming to represent all Americans. After leaving the vice presidency in 1977, Nelson returned to Kykuit. He spent his final years expanding the art collections and planning for the estate's long-term future. He'd always been the most committed of Junior's sons to maintaining the property. He saw it as a cultural asset, not just a residence. He died on January 26, 1979, at age 70. His death removed the primary advocate for keeping Kykuit in active family use. The remaining brothers, John III had died in 1978, faced a decision. David was the youngest and most engaged in estate matters after Nelson's death. Lawrence focused on conservation projects elsewhere. Winthrop had died in 1973. David didn't want to live at Kykuit. He had his own Westchester property that suited him better. The question was whether to maintain Kykuit for occasional family use or transition it to institutional ownership. The arithmetic pushed toward transition. Operating costs continued rising. Staff wages increased with inflation and labor market changes.
Energy costs spiked during the 1970s oil crises. Property taxes, even with the estate's tax-exempt portions, remained substantial. More importantly, the next generation, Nelson's children, David's children, the other grandchildren, didn't have the same attachment. They'd grown up visiting Kykuit, but not living there. The house represented family history, but not current identity. Through the 1980s, negotiations proceeded with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The framework was complex. The family would donate the house and core grounds while retaining certain areas for private use. The trust would assume responsibility for preservation and public access. Operating costs would be shared between the trust, endowment income, and admission fees. The formal transfer occurred in 1991. The National Trust took ownership. Kykuit became open to public tours in 1994. The Rockefeller family retained use rights for family gatherings in certain spaces.
The transformation was complete. What had been billed as a private residence for America's richest family became a public historic site. The house that had been designed to be seen only by invited guests now welcomed thousands of paying visitors annually. The change meant everything and nothing. Everything because ownership shifted fundamentally, nothing because the physical property remained largely unchanged. The rooms looked the same. The gardens followed the same patterns. The art collections stayed in place, supplemented by loans from Rockefeller family members. But the purpose had transformed. Kykuit was no longer a working residence where a family lived and operated. It was a museum of a particular kind of American wealth. A preserved example of how fortunes of that scale translated into physical space. Tour guides led visitors through the reception rooms, explaining the architecture, the art, the family history. They walked the gardens, photographing the sculptures Nelson had commissioned. They stood on the terraces, looking out at the views the Rockefellers had looked out at for 80 years. What the tours explained depended on which narratives the guides emphasized. Some focused on philanthropy, the good the Rockefeller fortune had done. Some acknowledged Standard Oil's monopoly but framed it as historical context. Very few discussed Ludlow in detail. Almost none mentioned the dozens of servants whose labor maintained the illusion of effortless beauty. This selective storytelling wasn't necessarily malicious. It reflected the difficulty of presenting complicated history to tourists who expect clear takeaways. Kykuit was beautiful. The Rockefellers did fund transformative philanthropy. Standard Oil was built through monopoly practices. Ludlow happened. Workers were paid modestly to maintain extraordinary luxury. All of these statements are true. Holding them simultaneously is harder than picking one and building a narrative around it. The estate today operates as a historic site. Tours run from May through November. Admission costs roughly $25 to $30 depending on tour level. Roughly 30,000 to 40,000 visitors come annually. Revenue from admissions covers some operating costs, but not all. The endowment provides additional support. The National Trust subsidizes the remainder. Operating a property of this scale remains expensive, even without a family in residence. Staff requirements decreased after becoming a museum, but didn't disappear. Groundskeepers maintain the gardens, housekeepers clean the interiors, security monitors the property, tour guides manage visitors, administrative staff handle bookings and operations, maintenance crews perform repairs. The work is different from when Kykuit was a working residence, but it's still substantial. The estate still requires constant labor to maintain its appearance. The difference is that labor is now framed as preservation rather than service.
Standing at Kykuit today, the views remain extraordinary. The Hudson River curves below. Hills rise green and ordered in every direction. The gardens cascade down the terraces in geometric perfection. But look more carefully. Look past the beauty to what maintains it. The gardeners pruning, weeding, planting. The maintenance workers repairing stonework, cleaning fountains, monitoring irrigation. The housekeeping staff dusting furniture, mopping floors, maintaining rooms that must look perfect for tomorrow's tour groups. The labor that made Kykuit function in 1913 still functions today, just under different employment structures and with different justifications. The transformation from private residence to public historic site changed ownership, but not the fundamental equation. Maintaining beauty at this scale requires constant work and substantial money. The National Trust's involvement means the costs are now partially subsidized by public interest in historic preservation. Visitor fees mean the public pays directly for access, but neither revenue source fully covers expenses. Endowment income fills the gap. Endowment funded by Rockefeller wealth accumulated through Standard Oil. So even in its current form, Kykuit remains what it always was: extraordinary beauty, sustained by economic systems that concentrate wealth and distribute costs unevenly. This isn't unique to Kykuit. Nearly every great estate turned historic site faces the same arithmetic. Biltmore, Hearst Castle, Waddesdon Manor all require millions annually to maintain. All struggle with how to present their histories honestly, while also attracting visitors who fund operations. The compromise is usually selective truth. Emphasize what's admirable, acknowledge what's problematic briefly. Focus on beauty, architecture, art. Mention labor, extraction, and exploitation in passing, if at all. Kykuit's tours mention that staff maintained the house. They might note that many servants worked there. They generally don't detail the 4:30 a.m. wake times, the rigid hierarchies, the wages paid versus art purchased, or the fundamental inequality that structure represented. This isn't surprising. Museums exist partly to preserve history and partly to provide pleasant experiences for visitors. Dwelling on exploitation isn't pleasant. Most visitors prefer admiring the gardens to contemplating who planted them and under what conditions. But that preference is itself revealing. We're comfortable with beauty. We're uncomfortable with the costs of beauty, and we prefer institutions that allow us to experience the first without confronting the second too directly. Kykuit offers that comfort. Walk the gardens, admire the sculptures, tour the house, marvel at the art, leave inspired by what wealth and taste can create. Just don't look too closely at the foundation. Don't ask too many questions about Standard Oil's monopoly practices, or Ludlow's burning tents, or the housemaids earning $300 per year while paintings cost $100,000. Don't examine too carefully how wealth at this scale accumulates and what systems enable that accumulation. The estate permits these questions but doesn't require them, and most visitors don't ask. Perhaps that's fine. Perhaps expecting a historic house tour to deliver comprehensive economic and moral analysis is unreasonable. People visit Kykuit for beauty and history, not political education. But the questions remain whether asked or not, and avoiding them doesn't make them disappear. It just means they're deferred, left for someone else to address, kicked down the road for future generations to confront.
So what do you build when you know that half the country sees your fortune as stolen? Kykuit was built to answer that question, to demonstrate that Rockefeller wealth could create something beyond monopoly profits, to show taste, restraint, cultural sophistication, to argue through architecture that the family was more than its critics claimed. Did it work? Partially. The estate is beautiful. The collections are significant. The philanthropy funded by Rockefeller wealth did genuine good. The foundation's medical research saved lives. The education funding built institutions. The public health initiatives eliminated diseases. None of this erases Standard Oil's monopoly practices. None of it changes what happened at Ludlow. None of it eliminates the fundamental inequality between owners of capital and workers who maintain it. But it complicates the narrative. The Rockefellers were robber barons who built their fortune through practices that were legal but ruthless. The Rockefellers funded transformative philanthropy that improved millions of lives. Both statements are true. Holding both simultaneously is harder than choosing one and dismissing the other. Kykuit embodies this complexity. It's magnificent. It's also a monument to extraction. It demonstrates what wealth can create. It also demonstrates who pays for creation and who benefits.
Consider the invisible labor chapter earlier in this investigation. The housemaids waking at 4:30 a.m., the rigid hierarchies, the wages that were fair by their era's standards but still represented a tiny fraction of what maintained the house cost annually. Those workers had names. Most are lost to history. A few survive in employment records: Mary Sullivan, housemaid; Patrick O'Brien, chauffeur; Giovanni Rossini, gardener. First names, last names, positions held, wages earned, dates of service. But their lives beyond those facts, their thoughts about the family they served, their dreams, frustrations, satisfactions, those are gone. The archives preserve what matters to management: employment dates, wages, disciplinary actions, reasons for departure. The workers themselves disappeared from the record the moment they left service. This is what concentrated wealth does at scale. It creates beauty that endures while erasing the people who made that beauty possible. The house survives, the gardens survive, the collections survive. The workers become footnotes, statistics, demographic categories. Not because the Rockefellers were uniquely cruel. By the standards of great estates, they treated staff relatively well, but relatively well within a system of profound inequality still means profound inequality.
The dual truths refuse resolution. Kykuit is an achievement. Kykuit is a document of exploitation. It's beautiful. It's also brutal in the economic systems required to sustain it. The family was generous with philanthropic giving. The family operated within structures that required labor to be undervalued relative to capital. You can't architecture away these contradictions. You can't donate enough to erase origins. You can't make labor conditions retroactively fair by paying death benefits or Christmas bonuses. What you can do is acknowledge complexity, resist the urge to flatten history into simple hero or villain narratives. Recognize that the same fortune that funded life-saving medical research also came from monopoly profits extracted from consumers who had no choice but to buy from Standard Oil at the prices Standard Oil set. The Rockefellers weren't monsters. They were humans navigating circumstances that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. They made choices within systems they didn't create, but certainly benefited from. Some of those choices were admirable. Some were harmful. Most were both. Kykuit stands as evidence of what those choices produced: the house itself, the gardens, the collections, the preservation effort that keeps it accessible to future generations. All of this exists because the Rockefellers decided it should. But so do the workers whose names disappeared from the record. So do the communities affected by Standard Oil's monopoly practices. So do the families destroyed at Ludlow. So do the millions of Americans who bought petroleum products at inflated prices because no alternatives existed. These realities coexist. They don't cancel each other out. The philanthropy doesn't excuse the monopoly. The monopoly doesn't invalidate the philanthropy. Both happened. Both shaped America. Both matter. Walking through Kykuit today means walking through this history. The tour guides won't frame it this way. The official narrative emphasizes achievement and preservation, but the evidence is there for anyone willing to look. The service stairs hidden behind panels, the basement corridors where staff moved invisibly, the bell systems that controlled their movements, the wage records showing what maintaining beauty actually cost in human labor, the contrast between what art pieces sold for and what workers earned annually. These details tell a story the tours prefer not to emphasize, but they're as real as the gardens, as present as the sculpture collections, as relevant as the architectural history. Kykuit is a mirror. What we see depends on how closely we look and what we're willing to examine. The surface is beautiful. The depth is complicated. An honest engagement requires looking past surface into depth, even when depth is uncomfortable.
The estate today operates under a model that would have seemed unimaginable in 1913. Jointly managed, public access, preservation funded by admission fees, endowment, and institutional support. The Rockefeller family retains rights to certain areas for private gatherings, but the house is no longer a working residence. This transformation happened because the arithmetic eventually forced it. Operating Kykuit as a purely private residence became unsustainable. Not impossible, the family could afford it, but increasingly difficult to justify, given changing tax structures, changing social attitudes, and changing family needs. The solution? Transfer to the National Trust with retained family access preserved the estate while distributing costs more broadly. Preservation became a public good, funded partly by public resources, accessible to anyone who pays admission. This seems democratic. A house built by monopoly profits is now open to the public. Anyone can walk the gardens Rockefeller money created. Anyone can tour the rooms where some of America's most powerful people gathered. But access isn't the same as equity. Admission costs $25 to $30. Tour capacity is limited. The estate is in Westchester County, accessible primarily to those with cars or resources to travel there. The audiences skew wealthy, white, educated, demographics similar to the Rockefellers themselves. So even in its public form, Kykuit primarily serves those already privileged. The transformation from private to public didn't fundamentally democratize access. It just changed the mechanisms by which access is controlled and who benefits from ongoing operation. The preservation itself raises questions. Why preserve this particular house? America contains thousands of historic properties with important stories. Many struggle for funding. Many close. Many are demolished. Kykuit survives partly because of the Rockefeller commitment to maintaining it, and partly because the Rockefeller name carries weight that opens doors and generates funding. The same power that built the house enables its preservation. Is that wrong? Not necessarily. Preservation requires resources, and the Rockefellers provided them. But it does mean that which histories get preserved and celebrated reflects existing power structures. Houses built by monopoly profits get million-dollar preservation efforts. Houses built by working families generally don't. So even the preservation framework perpetuates patterns Kykuit's existence created. Concentrated wealth shapes which stories survive and how they're told. The tours today tell visitors about Rockefeller philanthropy, about the foundation's work eradicating disease, about the art collections and architectural significance, about Nelson's political career and the family's impact on American culture. These stories are true and important, but they're also incomplete. A complete story would include Standard Oil's monopoly practices in detail, would name the workers killed during construction and in Ludlow, would document the servants' lives with the same care applied to documenting the art collections, would examine the economic systems that enabled wealth accumulation at this scale and whether those systems were just. That complete story would be harder to tell on a 90-minute tour. It would make visitors uncomfortable. It might reduce ticket sales. It would complicate the clean narrative of American success and philanthropic legacy.
So the incomplete story persists, not through malice, but through the structural reality that institutions depend on visitors who expect certain experiences. Challenge those expectations too directly, and the institution struggles financially. Preservation requires revenue. Revenue requires appealing to audiences. Audiences prefer inspiration to discomfort. The cycle maintains itself. Kykuit survives because it provides experiences people pay for. Those experiences emphasize beauty and achievement. The darker elements get acknowledged briefly and then passed over. And the next generation of visitors learns an incomplete history that feels complete because the alternatives aren't readily available for comparison. What questions remain unresolved? Was the Rockefeller fortune legitimate? It was legal by the standards of its time, but legality and legitimacy aren't identical. Standard Oil operated within laws, but those laws were written partly by people Standard Oil money influenced. Calling it simply legal or illegal misses the more important question: was it just? Should wealth at this scale exist? Even if we accept that Rockefeller's business practices were legitimate, the concentration of wealth they produced raises questions about economic systems. Should any individual or family possess resources equivalent to what millions of others lack? What does that concentration mean for democracy, opportunity, and social cohesion? Did the philanthropy justify the extraction? The foundation did remarkable good, but if the good was funded by monopoly profits, does that change its moral weight? Can you build hospitals with money taken from consumers who had no choice but to pay inflated prices?
Who actually paid for Kykuit? The work crew members, many of whose names are lost. The servants who maintained it. The consumers who bought Standard Oil products at monopoly prices. The communities affected by refinery pollution. The families destroyed at Ludlow. The taxpayers who now subsidize its preservation. The costs were distributed broadly. The benefits accumulated narrowly. Could it have been different? If Rockefeller had paid workers more, if Standard Oil hadn't pursued monopoly, if wealth had been distributed more equitably, would we still have the medical advances, the universities, the cultural institutions Rockefeller money funded, or would those goods have emerged through different mechanisms? These questions don't have clean answers. They're designed to provoke thought rather than provide conclusions, because Kykuit's story is ultimately a story about choice, individual choices about how to build wealth and how to use it, systemic choices about what economic structures we create and maintain, cultural choices about what we celebrate and what we critique. Buildings do not choose their owners or their roles. People do. Systems do. Societies do. Kykuit exists because John D. Rockefeller Sr. chose to build Standard Oil through monopoly practices, because workers chose or were compelled to build it for modest wages, because servants chose or were compelled to maintain it for a few $100s per year, because Junior chose to preserve it, because Nelson chose to expand it, because the National Trust chose to accept it, because we, as a society, chose to preserve it rather than dozens of other properties with equally important stories. Every choice involved trade-offs. What we gained, what we lost, whether the exchange was worth it, those remain open questions. The Hudson River still curves below the estate. The hills still rise green and ordered. The terraces still cascade in geometric perfection. The house still stands, maintained now by workers whose wages are better than the 1913 housemaids, but still modest relative to preservation budgets that run to millions. The beauty endures. The questions endure, and time moves forward, patient and relentless, while we decide what Kykuit means and whether the choices that created it are choices we want to continue making.